Chapter 4 of A Wrinkle in Time. The Black Thing. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin, and Mrs. Whatsit's authoritative voice called out, "Quiet, child." Did a shadow fall across the moon, or did the moon simply go out, extinguished by it as abruptly and completely as a candle? There was still the sound of leaves, a terrifying rushing. All light was gone, darkness was complete. Suddenly the wind was gone, and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached for him, her fingers touched nothing. She screamed out, "Charles!" and whether it was to him or for him to help her, she did not know. The word was flung back down her throat, and she choked on it. She was completely alone. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere, either to save or to turn to. She was alone in a fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporal Meg simply was not. Then she felt her numb limbs again. Her legs and arms were tingling faintly as though she had been asleep. She blinked her eyes rapidly, but though she herself was somehow back, nothing else was. It was not as simple as darkness or absence of light. Darkness has a tangible quality. It can be moved through and felt. In darkness you can bark your shins, and the world of things still exists around you. She was lost in a horrifying void. It was the same way with the silence. This was more than silence. A deaf person can feel vibrations. Here, there was nothing to feel. Suddenly, was aware of her heart beating rapidly against the cage of her ribs. Had it stopped before? What had made it start again? The tingling in her arms and legs grew stronger, and suddenly she felt movement. This movement, she felt, must be the turning of the earth, rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course about the sun. And this feeling of moving with the earth was somehow like the feeling of being in the ocean, out in the ocean beyond this rising and falling of the breakers, lying on the moving water, pulsing gently with the swells and feeling the gentle, inexorable tug of the moon. "I am asleep. I am dreaming," she thought. "I'm having a nightmare. I want to wake up. Let me wake up." "Charles may well," Charles Wallace said. "That was quite a trip. I do think you might have warned us." Light began to pulse and quiver. Meg blinked and shoved shakily at her glasses, and there was Charles Wallace standing indignantly in front of her, his hands on his hips. "Meg!" he shouted. Calvin, where are you?" She saw Charles, she heard him, but she could not go to him. She could not shove through the strange, trembling light to meet him. Calvin's voice came as though it were pushing through a cloud. "Just give me time, will you? I'm older than you are." Meg gasped. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there and then he was. It wasn't that part of him came first and then the rest of him followed, like a hand and an arm, then an eye, then a nose. It was just a sort of shimmering, a looking at Calvin through the water, through smoke, through fire. And then he was solid and reassuring. "Meg!" Charles Wallace's voice came. "Meg! Calvin, where's Meg?" "Right here," she tried to say, but her voice seemed to be caught at its source. "Meg!" Calvin cried, and he turned around, looking about wildly. "Mrs. Witch, you haven't left Meg behind, have you?" Charles Wallace shouted. "If you've hurt Meg, any of you," Calvin started, but suddenly Meg felt a violent push and a shattering as though she had been thrust through a wall and glass. "Oh, there you are," Charles Wallace said, and rushed over to her and hugged her. "But where am I?" Meg asked breathlessly, relieved to hear that her voice was now coming out of her in more or less a normal way. She looked around rather wildly. They were standing in a sunlit field, and the air about them was moving with the delicious fragrance that came only on the rarest of spring days when the sun's touch is gentle and the apple blossoms are just beginning to unfold. She pushed her glasses up on her nose to reassure herself that what she was seeing was real. They had left the silver glint of the biting autumnal evening, and now around them, Everything was golden with light. The grasses of the field were a tender new green, and scattered about were tiny multicolored flowers. Meg turned slowly to face a mountain reaching so high into the sky that its peak was lost in a crown of puffy white clouds. From the trees at the base of the mountain came a sudden singing of birds. There was an air of such ineffable peace and joy all around her that her heart's wild thumping slowed. When shall we meet? When shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Came Mrs. Who's voice. Suddenly the three of them were there. Mrs. Whatsit with her pink stole askew, Mrs. Who with her spectacles gleaming, and Mrs. Which still little more than a shimmer. Delicate multicolored butterflies were fluttering about them, as though in greeting. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who began to giggle. They giggled until it seemed that whatever their private joke was, they would fall down with the wild fun of it. The shimmer seemed to be laughing too. It became vaguely darker and more solid. And then there appeared a figure in a black robe and a black peaked hat, beady eyes, a beaked nose, and long gray hair. In a bony claw clutched a broomstick. Well, just to keep you girls happy, the strange voice said, and Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who fell into each other's arms in gales of laughter. If you ladies have had your fun, I think you shall tell Kevin and Meg a little more all about this, Charles Wallace said coldly. You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her off this way without any warning. Fixerant amino faro et porto lequentis, Mrs. Who intoned. Horace, to action little, less to words inclined. Mrs. Who, I wish you'd stop quoting. Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Whatsit adjusted her stole. But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out the words on her own. And we mustn't lose our senses of humor, Mrs. Witch said. The only way to cope with something deadly serious is to try to treat it a little lightly. But that's going to be hard for Meg, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's going to be hard for her to realize that we are serious. What about me? Calvin asked. The life of your father isn't at stake, Mrs. Whatsit told him. What about Charles Wallace, then? Mrs. Whatsit's unoiled door hinge voice was warm with affection and pride. Charles Wallace knows. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake. But remember, Mrs. Who said, our proof ositiv arom Euripides. Nothing is hopeless. We must hope for nothing. Where are we now, and how did we get here? Calvin asked. Uriel, the third planet of the star Moloch, in the spiral nebula Messier 101. This I'm supposed to believe? Calvin asked indignantly. As you like, Mrs. Witch said coldly. For some reason, Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in which one could put complete trust. It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anything else that's happened. Well then, someone just tell me how we got here. Calvin's voice was still angry, and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here. Oh, we don't travel at the speed of anything, Mrs. Whatsit explained earnestly. We tesser, or you might say we wrinkle. Clear as mud, Calvin said. Tesser, Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Mrs. Witch started to speak, and no one did not interrupt when Mrs. Witch was speaking. Mrs. Whatsit is young and naive. She keeps thinking she can explain things in words, Mrs. Who. In words, Mrs. Who said. Qui plus salt plus citate. French, you know. The more a man knows, the less he talks. But she has to use words for Calvin and Meg, Charles reminded Mrs. Who. If you brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on. Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In an intensity of her question, she had forgotten all about the tesseract. Is my father here? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not here, Meg. Let Mrs. Whatsit explain. She is young, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Mrs. Who and me. We stopped here, Mrs. Whatsit explained, more or less to catch our breaths, and to give you a chance to know what you're up against. But what about father? Meg asked. Is he all right? For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But you see, he's only one. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We cannot. Not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. Vitam impero vero. To stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do. That is what your father is doing, Mrs. Whatsit nodded, her voice, like Mrs. Who's, very serious and very solemn. Then she smiled her radiant smile. Now, why don't you three children wander around, and Charles can explain things a little. You're perfectly safe on Muriel. That's why we stopped here to rest. But aren't you coming with us? Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. Show them, she said to Mrs. Whatsit. And at something in her voice, Meg felt prickles of apprehension. Now? Mrs. Whatsit asked, her creaky voice rising in a squeak. Whatever it was Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. Whatsit uncomfortable too. Now, Mrs. Witch said, they may as well know. Should should I change? Mrs. Whatsit asked. Better. I hope it won't upset the children too much, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, as though to herself. Should I change too? Mrs. Who asked. Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes. But I'll have to admit, Mrs. Whatsit is the best at it. Work lobt den Meister, German. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform now too? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not yet, not here. You may wait. Now don't be frightened, loves, Mrs. Whatsit said. Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted and whitened. The pudding bag shape stretched, lengthened, and merged. And suddenly, before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had even imagined. And the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. Whatsit was surely no longer a Mrs. Whatsit. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse. For from the magnificently molded back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, and a man with a perfect dignity and virtue, and an exaltation of joy such as Meg had never seen before. No, she thought, not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders slowly a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon color of poetry. Calvin fell to his knees. No, Mrs. Whatsit said, though her voice was not Mrs. Whatsit's voice. Not to me, Calvin. Never to me. Stand up.